It's time for another episode of the Politics with Paul podcast with your host, Paul Rader. Today, we're going to talk about the Democratic and Republican parties. Whoa, what if we talk about that on a political podcast? Well, specifically, I'm going to talk about the variations within the Democratic and Republican parties, because oftentimes they get treated as these monoliths, as these hordes of people that all think and act the same way. Sometimes voters and politicians have a vested interest in doing so to paint the opposition a certain way to win elections, because the name of the game is to win elections. It's much easier to galvanize your like minded voters by describing the other side of the aisle as one specific way to try to combat them. It's not good for business if you're pointing out the facts that there are nuances within people's belief systems. But some voters and politicians also actually think their own side should be monolithic. And that's where you get this whole no true Scotsman fallacy of what a quote unquote real Democrat and real Republican should be. You often hear them called dinos, Democrats in name only, and rhinos, Republicans in name only. And then the media is also often guilty of painting giant groups of people as one way to more effectively facilitate engagement with their stories. But you'll sometimes get Republicans and Democrats that do go against the grain, so to speak, and have a completely antithetical view on an issue than their fellow party members. Or they'll have similar views, but not as strongly supporting or opposing the general view of their party. In any case, however, while members of each of the major parties tend to share a general stance on basic issues, for example, Republicans tend to be more against abortion and Democrats tend to support more gun control, you still get some variation in opinions on these issues and how each state variation of a party, each state affiliate of a party generally thinks is going to look somewhat different from another state's variation. A Wyoming Democrat and a Hawaii Democrat, while similar to some extent, are not going to be the same, and the same goes for a California Republican versus a Maryland Republican. So, how do these intra party, not inter party, differences make themselves apparent? How do we see differences between Democrats and other Democrats and between Republicans and other Republicans? And why do we see these disparities? And what are some specific examples? Well, let's talk about it. So, first of all, why the differences within the party's state variations? Got to make sure to make this very clear because sometimes they get treated as the same. Party does not equal ideology. And one of my former professors from grad school would be beside himself if I did not point that out specifically. Yes, most conservatives are Republicans. Yes, most liberals are Democrats. But that's not always the case. Trend over time of voters with either conservative or liberal ideology is what we might call sorting into their quote unquote correct party, where conservatives are correctly going into the Republican Party and liberals are correctly going into the Democratic Party. Now, sometimes these differences are based on political necessity. Maybe you have a serious disadvantage in voter registration, so you may shift more to the center to appeal to a wider range of voters. If Democrats are heavily outnumbered, they might try to go a little bit more to the right to get more to the center. If Republicans are more heavily outnumbered, they might try to go to the left to get a little more to the center. After all, people involved in politics are trying to win elections, and sometimes you need to do certain things, change up strategies so that you do win elections. That doesn't always happen, though, and party members often argue about what is necessary to win elections. Sometimes these differences are just based on their upbringing and environment. There used to be the prevailing thoughts in the early days of political science where demography is destiny. That was popularized by the Columbia School of Thought, as we call it, in the 1940s, that focused on the sociological aspects of political behavior. So, obviously, the old adage, demography is destiny, is not always true. You don't see 100% Republicans of a demographic group. You don't see 100% Democrats of a demographic group, but it does obviously have an impact. Where you come from, your environment is inevitably going to have an impact on what your political beliefs are. For example, rural areas tend to be more conservative and Republican, and urban areas tend to be more liberal and Democrat. So, states that are more rural might have a more conservative Republican leaning, whereas states that have a little bit more urbanization might have a little bit more of a liberal and Democratic leaning, or at least those areas within the state that are rural versus urban. So, also, differences in environments often mean that different issues are more pressing to these voters, these politicians, than for other people. Parties in the border states are likely to have differing opinions on immigration policy than their non border counterparts because simply border policy is not going to be as important to Maryland voters or Virginia voters versus in Texas or New Mexico. Obviously, there will still be some similarities for some people, but inevitably, being closer to a border state is going to have a different or is going to have a certain effect on your political opinion simply because you live near the border versus if you live far away from the border. But sometimes differences are not as much about diverging ideological views, but differing operations and structures and capabilities for the state affiliates of and the county affiliates of the Democratic and Republican parties. Generally speaking, every county and county equivalent area has their own Democrat and Republican Party affiliate. Might be a few cases where that's not the case, but how well resourced and powerful each are can differ greatly. And they're all going to have different environments to contend with that might shape their opinions a little bit differently than the Democratic and Republican parties at large. California Republicans, Florida Democrats, and other Democratic and Republican affiliates like them have had a lot of struggles gaining voters and representation in government and influencing policy. In fact, several years ago, California Republicans several years ago became outnumbered by independents. Florida Democrats were overtaken by Republicans back in 2021, and now they're over a million voters behind the Republican Party of Florida's voter registration numbers. So those kinds of realities might influence the parties to have to shift a little more to the center to appeal to a wider range of voters. Maybe not, but generally speaking, you might expect that to happen so that they can try to gain more support and therefore try to gain more representation in government and try to influence policy. But political necessity and upbringing can conflict for a state level party. You see intra-party arguments all the time as to how far to the left should a Democratic Party affiliate go? How far to the right should a Republican Party affiliate go? Political necessity might dictate the need for a more ideologically moderate approach for a party, but many members' upbringing has influenced their views much further to the left or to the right. Somebody, a Republican might be a lot more MAGA than your typical Republican. A Democrat might be a lot more progressive or even socialist than your average Democrat is going to be. What's good for an individual Democrat or Republican candidate might not be good for the party as a whole. And so individuals may make their differences known in certain beliefs and make a very strong case for their opinions. For example, with the Democratic Party at large, you saw a lot of progressives butt heads with their fellow Democrats because they thought the party should go more towards the left. Obviously, not every Democrat agrees. And you saw a similar thing with Republicans with the more MAGA contingent versus those who aren't so MAGA. There's a lot of butting heads there too. So, political necessity, upbringing, all these other factors may make some state and county Republican parties more conservative or less conservative than the Republican Party at large. And then a state or county level Democratic Party may be more to the left or less to the left than the Democratic Party at large because of all these factors. So, how exactly do you see and measure differences within the parties? So, you can look at instances of political infighting. Again, disagreements about the direction of a state level party tend to lead to power struggles. And this gets a lot more into the weeds of political wheeling and dealing that your regular voter is not necessarily going to be paying attention to, but you might have the example of a faction who doesn't believe current leadership is sufficiently supportive of the Democratic or Republican figureheads and may try to push out that leadership if that faction is powerful enough. So, in the case of Republicans, maybe there's a faction that thinks that their Republican figureheads are not sufficiently supportive of Donald Trump and the whole MAGA ethos. For Democrats, they may have felt that some were not supportive enough of Joe Biden. Now, obviously, Joe Biden's about to leave office, but point still stands. When Joe Biden was in office, sometimes there might have been butting of heads as to whether they thought there was enough support of Joe Biden or Barack Obama when he was in office. And you can also apply this to the state level figureheads like the governors of states, whether they're sufficiently supportive enough of the governor's agenda. You might see a lot of infighting within a party there. Or, obviously, conversely, if it's the opposite party from the governor, maybe for Democrats, for example, in Florida, if they feel that some Democrats are not being sufficient or effective in opposing Governor Ron DeSantis and his agenda, you might see a lot of struggles for power and leadership there. Another way we can look at it is through public opinion polling. Some people will straight up tell you their issue stances and general ideology. And so you actually still see some Republicans call themselves liberal and some Democrats call themselves conservatives. I've seen it. You just look at the more in-depth details of a lot of public opinion polling. Yes, most Democrats are going to say that they're liberal, and most Republicans are going to say they're conservative. But you do find those odd ones out, so to speak, in a lot of cases. But also, not every voter thinks along ideological lines. In fact, many of them don't. And some of them have different concepts of what being a quote unquote true conservative or a true liberal is. Some Democrats think liberal is being something different than what another Democrat thinks. Some Republicans think being conservative is than what another Republican thinks. There's really no clear way to say X state's party is the most conservative Republican state level party in the nation, or X party is the most liberal Democratic state level party in the nation. It's more based on inferences and piecing together other data. But this is not a foolproof concept. There's just no way to say to rank 1 to 50 which states' Republican parties are the most conservative to the least conservative, which Democratic parties are the most liberal to the least liberal. Can't really do that. But there are some deeper studies by think tanks and public opinion research organizations as to these different strains of thoughts amongst the Democratic and Republican parties. Pew Research Center had a study about like 8 to 10 years ago that came up with names for different blocks of Democrats and Republicans based on their divergence of views, but I had trouble finding it, so unfortunately can't really highlight it there. But there was also a Pew Research poll surveying ideological and party affiliations for each state, but the info is from 2015, so it's going to be somewhat outdated, though it's still useful. And you see a little bit of differentiation between, okay, this percentage of people say in X state say that they're Republican, but how many of them actually said they're conservative? How many people in a state said they were Democrat, but then how many of them also said they were liberal? So a couple of examples, and again, 2015, so a little bit outdated, but Alabama had 52% said that they were Republican or lean Republican, and 50% said that they were conservative. Uh, we've got Colorado, where 33% said, or excuse me, 28% said that they were liberal. And then in Colorado, 42% of voters said they were Democrat or lean Democrat. So some discrepancies there between the two. Again, party is not the same as ideology, even though the two are obviously closely correlated. And then the Brookings Institution, another example, they just had a study in December 2024, and according to their research, they came up with three groups each for Democrats and Republicans. For Democrats, there was mainstream Democrat, progressive, and then Democratic Socialist. For Republicans, they came up with MAGA, mainstream conservative, and moderate Republican. Didn't necessarily break it down by state, but it just goes to show you just the different strains of thought within the two major parties. And then also you've got to look at differences between how the elites think. Those are the politicians, the political movers and shakers, versus interest groups versus voters. Each of these collectives as a whole think and act differently. Elites and groups tend to be more rigid and more to the left for Democrats than the typical Democratic voter, or at least the average Democratic voter. And likewise, elites and groups on the right, or for Republicans, tend to be more to the right of the average Republican voter. And this harkens back to an idea back from the 1960s. A political scientist by the name of Philip Converse had this seminal work where he talked about the idea of political constraint, which is basically how rigid your belief system is. If you change one view or attitude in that belief system, does that mean you have to change your views and attitudes in the rest of the system? So people who have high constraint, changing one view or attitude means having to change another because they're closely linked together. And if you have low constraint, changing one view or attitude has little to no impact on other views and attitudes. And you typically see elites and groups have interest groups have a higher constraints. They don't really change their views and attitudes often, and when they do, they feel they have to shift a lot of other views and attitudes because they're all closely interconnected. Whereas for voters, you typically see a lower constraint. They change their view on one issue, not necessarily going to affect their views on other issues, or at least not by much. And elites that don't toe a certain line might get punished by interest groups that might otherwise support that politician. So some of that interaction between the various groups, but also elites might respond to voters as well. So a lot of complicated dynamics in that regard. Also, how each state votes in elections also signals some variation within the parties as to how strongly the electorates lean Democrat or Republican. Now, of course, that's partially a function of how many voters in a state are Democrats, how many of them are Republicans, how many of them are independents and third parties, because states can vary considerably in that regard. For example, Maryland's got significantly more Democrats than Republicans. Uh, if you go to Utah, I believe Utah tracks voter party affiliation. Yes, they do. Or Idaho, for example. I know for a fact they track that. There are a lot more Republicans than there are Democrats. Wyoming is the same case. And so you have to keep that in mind. But still, regardless, you see varying degrees of split ticket voting where voters on the same ballot will vote for a Republican in one office, but then vote for a Democrat in another office, and then maybe even a third party in another office. In any case, if they don't vote straight ticket, meaning they just vote Republican up and down the ticket, they just vote Democrat up, down the ticket, split tickets, the opposite, where they will vote for people in multiple parties. And you have varying degrees of that within states. And some states with a noticeable lean toward one party are much more uniform in their voting for that party than other states. Although governor's races seem to be a bit more resistant to that straight ticket voting, especially in more recent years. Uh, a few examples here. Larry Hogan was a Republican governor of Maryland. He won in 2014 and 2018. Did not run in 2022. I believe Maryland has term limits on their governor, so that's why he didn't run there. Charlie Baker was a Republican governor in Massachusetts, 2014 and 2018. Those two, Maryland and Massachusetts, are both very Democratic states, but were willing to vote for a Republican governor. And Phil Scott is the current Republican governor of Vermont. He won in 2016, 2018, 2020, 2022, and 2024. Another case where you don't expect them to necessarily vote for a Republican governor, but they did 5 times already. Other current governors on the flip side, the Democrat Laura Kelly in Kansas, which is a very Republican state, she won in 2018 and 2022. And then Andy Beshear in Kentucky, Democrat, won in 2019 and 2023. His father was also a governor of Kentucky as well. One is a little bit less Republican, but still already uh, showing a trend towards the Republican Party. All cases of states that are typically toward one party, but then voted for a governor of a different party. So that is another case where you might say, okay, this Democratic Party, this state's Democratic Party might be a little less hardcore Democrat than other states. And then this state's Republican Party might be less hardcore Republican than another state. Again, not a very concrete, specific way to say, okay, this is how Republican this state level party is. This is how Democrat this state level Democratic Party is. Again, can't quite make specific judgments based on that, but you can have some level of comparison where, oh no, this state is like, you better be a Democrat. Oh, and another state might be, oh no, you better be a Republican for us to vote for you. In some states, that's a little less the case, especially when it comes to governors. So, an overview of intra-party variation over time, because obviously throughout history, we've seen a lot of major examples, and just for a few of them to point out, and we're just talking about Democrats and Republicans here. Whigs a little less so, or not as we're not going to focus really on the Whigs and Federalists, although the Whigs, that was part of the issue with their survival, is that there were so many disparate interests in the Whig Party, and ultimately what killed their party was the slavery issue. There's a lot of pro-slavery Whigs and a lot of anti-slavery Whigs. The main thing that held the Whigs together was their hatred for Andrew Jackson when he was president, and then when he left office, there wasn't really much to hold the Whig Party together after that. But the vacuum they left, in the vacuum that resulted from them dissipating, then you had the Republican Party come in the 1850s, founded primarily on the basis of being anti-slavery. And in the Reconstruction era, you had what they called radical Republicans, and they were a faction against the moderate Republicans. And moderate Republicans amongst their ranks were Abraham Lincoln and Andrew Johnson, two presidents of the United States. And so radical Republicans often duked it out with moderate Republicans, even finding themselves at odds with Lincoln and Johnson. And a lot of this was they thought the two presidents were not nearly strong enough supporters of civil rights, emancipation, enfranchisement of black voters. And that was definitely true of Johnson. Andrew Johnson was not not exactly the most shall we say, he was quite bigoted. Let's put it that way. Uh, Radical Republicans, they were very ardent supporters of abolishing slavery completely, which fortunately we did in the end, but uh, they influenced a lot of Reconstruction policies, especially when they started accumulating more representation in Congress. But that wouldn't last for a whole lot longer after that era because in the towards the very end of the 1800s and in the beginning of the 1900s, you had a schism between what were called black and tan versus lily white Republicans. So, again, Republican Party founded in the 1850s primarily in opposition to slavery, but once Reconstruction ended, they found themselves at a crossroads because as the North pulled out of the South, Democrats started sweeping congressional, state, and local offices in the South again and instating Jim Crow segregation to stifle black voters. So you had the lily white Republicans who felt that political survival in the South was only possible with an all white Republican Party. And so they advocated for disenfranchising black voters who had basically just gotten the right to vote. And then you had the black and tan Republicans who were the traditional biracial wing of the Republican Party and wanted to continue that integration of black voters. And in any case, South continues to disenfranchise black voters. Jim Crow segregation becomes more stifling. Lily white Republicans, sort of won out in the end, but they still won. They sort of won the schism against the black and tan Republicans, but Southern Democrats still pushed them out of office for the most part. Anyways, occasionally you saw Republicans win a U.S. Senate seat or even a state for president, but by and large, the Republicans got pushed out regardless of the ultimate results of that black and tan versus lily white schism. Speaking of those Democrats, you had the Southern Democrats, also called Dixiecrats, very pro-segregationist, anti-civil rights for racial minorities, and they were once the dominant view of the Democratic Party, but they eventually were overtaken by Northern Democrats with differing views on race, especially when you had the Civil Rights Act during the 1960s and other civil rights legislation, also abolished the poll taxes, which were another method of trying to stop black voters from voting because a lot of times they were poor or more poor than white voters, and so poll taxes were a way for them to say, if you want to vote, you got to pay this amount. And the way they got around that for poor white voters is oftentimes they had a grandfather clause, which said, oh, if your grandfather was able to vote, you don't have to pay this poll tax. So very insidious ways that they found to consolidate their power. And sometimes their heated disagreements with the Democratic Party at large led to third-party bids in particularly the 1948 and 1968 presidential elections, where Strom Thurmond, who probably his biggest claim to fame was speaking out against integration in favor of segregation for a full 24 hours, filibustering the Senate, basically praising segregation policy. He was the States' Rights Party candidate in 1948 and even won 4 states, although Harry Truman, the Democrat, did win re-election. George Wallace, most known for being that Alabama governor who stood on the steps of the University of Alabama trying to prevent black students from entering the school. He was the American Independent Party candidate in 1968 and won 5 states, and that was the year that Republican Richard Nixon won his first term. So, a couple of those notable examples in both the Republican and Democratic parties. Historically, But variation within the parties may have been at an all-time high around the 1940s and 1950s, because the American Political Science Association put out a report basically lamenting the lack of differences between the two parties. There's a report called Toward a More Responsible Two-Party System, if you ever want to look it up. Basically, the lack of difference between the two parties was because of the variation within the two. There was a lot of conservatives and liberals in the Republican Party. There were a lot of there were a lot of conservatives and liberals in the Democratic Party. But starting in the 1960s, the American Political Science Association, APSA, they kind of started to get their wish because the parties started drifting apart from each other, slowly becoming more uniform in ideology within their parties. And you can still see the effects of that today. Conservatives started moving more and more towards the Republican Party. Liberals started moving more and more towards the Democratic Party. And one of the big catalysts for that was Barry Goldwater from Arizona when he ran for president in 1964. Now, he got clobbered in that election, but he really put his conservative ethos at the forefront of his campaign and really had his big impact was not so much in that campaign, but really going down the road. He was part of that signaled that whole conservatives moving to the Republican Party, liberals moving more toward the Democratic Party. And so in large part because of that shift, some states that were once historically very Democrat or Republican have now become very much the opposite way. Most of the southern states that were part of that blue wall for Democrats, they wouldn't vote for yellow dog Democrats. I would vote for a yellow dog before I vote for a Republican. Now, most, if not all, those are very strongly Republican. States like Alabama, Arkansas, Florida, who wouldn't vote for a Republican governor for years and years, and their state legislatures were almost completely, if not completely, Democratic. Now they are very Republican. Massachusetts and Vermont used to be strongly Republican, but now they're very strongly Democrat. Things that you would not expect coming from today, but when you look back at history, obviously, things changed, especially over the course of 60, 70, 80 years. As for specific state examples, let's look at, for example, Alaska. So, Alaska Republicans are kind of an odd bunch due to their power sharing agreements, despite having numerical majorities in both the state legislative chambers. They have a majority, numbers wise, of the state House there and of the state Senate there, but several Republicans in multiple elections or following multiple elections have broken off to form governing coalitions with Democrats in the state Senate and then in the state House with Democrats and independents, because there are a few independents in the state House. But this the 2024 elections are not the only instance of that. In the state House, there were power sharing agreements following 2016, 2018, 2020, and 2022. And in the state Senate, you had power sharing agreements in 2006, 2008, 2010, and 2022. Though in 2008 and 2010, the chamber was split evenly with Democrats at 10 Republicans, 10 Democrats, anyways. But several Republicans not really didn't really go over the party line, but they did come up with a power sharing agreement with Democrats and in some cases independents. And there's really nothing like that in other states currently. When you look at Alaska's voting history, yeah, it tends to be fairly Republican, but they're not so ardently like we vote Republican every time. Uh, President really it votes Republican just about every time. But when you get to the state level, it's kind of a quirky state, very interesting state, very quirky. Minnesota, another example where you have a level of uniqueness to the state parties. The Democratic Party there is actually called the Democratic Farmer Labor Party, or the DFL. And that is because the Farmer Labor Party in the early 1900s was a quite powerful third party that gained quite a bit of representation at both Congress and and state level politics. But in 1944, Democrats and the Farmer Labor Party would merge. So it's a unique blend of two parties that you find few, if any, analogs to in other states. And you really don't have a different kind of named party in other states, or at least not one's named like that. It's some variation of Democratic Party or some variation of Republican Party. But there was also for a time in Minnesota what they called independent Republicans. From the mid 1970s to the mid 1990s, the state party had changed its name to Independent Republicans to sort of distance themselves from national Republicans. Now, they're back to just being called Republicans now, but you had in Minnesota, you did have an instance where they were particularly unique relative to other Republican parties as well. Not to say that they're not unique now, but you did see uh, a more unusual step that they took in the 70s to 90s to slightly change their name, although they are now just Republicans again. Nebraska, simply by virtue of having at least a nominally nonpartisan state legislature, in reality, they are Democrats or Republicans. They just can't officially call themselves as such in campaigning and when they're in office. But due to being officially nonpartisan, this can somewhat obfuscate the general partisan leanings of these candidates. So, a unique situation there. You don't have any other state legislature that is officially nonpartisan in other states. And then, lastly, for examples, we're going to actually look at a collection of states that implement what's called fusion voting. Now, fusion voting allows more than one political party to nominate a candidate. So a Democrat can also have the endorsement of a third party, and a Republican can have the endorsement of a third party. Used to be a lot more common in the US. Today it's allowed in some form and only in Connecticut, Mississippi, New York, Oregon, and Vermont, though Mississippi doesn't really use it. A lot of other states haven't really addressed it, but there are a couple that have flat out banned, fusion voting. I believe New Jersey is one of them, but this inherently makes the Democratic and Republican parties in these states function a bit different than the Democratic and Republican parties in other states, simply because their candidates also have to appeal to these third parties. And some of these third parties are more to the left than your average Democrat, and some of them are more to the right than your average Republican. And even occasionally, though, you see candidates pull both the Democratic and Republican party endorsements. Not often, but you do occasionally see it. A few more specific examples of these states. Vermont has what's called the Vermont Progressive Party, VPP, which is probably the most powerful slash influential third party in any state. And so that sometimes pulls some Democratic candidates more to the left so that they can get that VPP endorsement. In New York, you have the Conservative Party, which can sometimes push Republican candidates more to the right, and the Working Families Party can sometimes push Democratic candidates more to the left because the Conservative Party is the main right-leaning third party, and Working Families Party is the main left-leaning third party in New York. So fusion voting, just by default, can make your Democratic and Republican parties a little function and think a little bit differently than states where fusion voting is not a thing. So that is going to end today's talk about, well, the specific subject that we're talking about for today, which is the variations within the Democratic and Republican parties. And so I'm going to end it off today, not on a random question. I'm going to do something a little bit different with the end of this episode, and it's going to be a random fact of the day that doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the topic that was discussed today. So some episodes will have a random question of the day. Other times I will focus on a random political fact and expound upon it. So today we're doing the latter. Today's random fact concerns counties and county government. Did you know that not every state has counties? There are over 3,100 counties and county equivalents, but not every state uses counties. Alaska has what we call boroughs, and there's 19 organized boroughs, but over half of the state's land is combined into what is called the unorganized borough. It's technically not actually a borough, it's just leftovers not part of the named boroughs, and it's made up of what are called census areas. So they governments the unorganized boroughs doesn't really operate the same way as they do in organized boroughs, which are their county equivalent. They do function similarly to counties. And then you've got Louisiana, which has parishes, and that's owed to Louisiana's French past, which still influences a lot of the state's political and judicial system today. They have police juries instead of county commissions. Again, though, similar functions, but they are not exactly the same. They are not counties, they are called parishes. And then you also have 41 independent cities, which are basically a county level administrative unit. Vast majority of these are in Virginia, like Richmond, for example, and Chesapeake, uh, and Norfolk, I believe Suffolk as well. And a few of those cities, I have a lot of family on my mom's side, so somewhat familiar with those areas. But the other non-Virginia independent cities are are Baltimore, Maryland, St. Louis, Missouri, and Carson City, Nevada. That's not to be confused with consolidated city county governments. Those are a bit different. Independent cities are not located inside a county's borders, but city county governments, that city is still within a border. For example, in my home state of Florida, Jacksonville is a consolidated city county. It's merged with the Duval government. Not the city county governments, the consolidated city county governments don't necessarily work the same way everywhere, but that's just one example. And additionally, here's a real odd one you might not expect. Not every county has a government. Connecticut abolished county governments back in 1959 and 1960, or 1959, 1960, right around at that time. But it still has counties for elections and other administrative purposes. Rhode Island's 5 counties exist only for judicial administration purposes, and then Massachusetts abolished 8 of its 14 county governments between 1997 and 2000. So, very curiously, some of the counties have a government, but in Massachusetts, but not uh, in some of the other counties. So to me, that's kind of weirder than just not having county governments at all. But very just fascinating stuff, at least to me, uh, in regards to those counties. So that does it for the random fact of the day. And that does it for today's episode. As always, thank you so much for listening. Like, comment, subscribe, share with those you know. Uh, Show notes have my links like my Facebook, LinkedIn, my book, Why Independents Rarely Win Elections and How They Can Become More Competitive, available in paperback and ebook form on Amazon, and a couple of my other stuff like my Matchmaker FM profile if you want to be a guest on here, or you want to have me as a guest on your podcast. So that's going to do it for today. Thank you so much again. And until next time, take care.